Hi, I'm Avis. You ever walk into a room and know, not just feel, know, you were never supposed to be invited? The day my father's will was read, my mother looked me dead in the eye and said, "Don't expect a penny." And then the lawyer reached for a second envelope. They'd erased me from the family on paper, just like they had in real life. But what they didn't expect was that my father had left behind more than money. What happens when the quiet daughter refuses to disappear? I got there early. Too early. The elevator was slow, humming like it had better things to do. I stood in front of the frosted glass doors of Atwood and Jameson Law, staring at the etched lettering, like it might spell out something different if I blinked twice. But it didn't. The truth never does. The receptionist looked up, startled. "You're Miss Delora?" I nodded. "I have a 9 a.m. appointment. Reading of Howard Elric's will." She motioned toward the hallway without smiling. "They're already inside." Of course they were. I walked down the corridor, the sound of my flats tapping against the floor, the only proof I belonged in that hallway. The conference room door was open. Inside, my mother and sister sat like they owned the oxygen in the room. Verlette wore navy, pearls, and a look of complete dismissal. Marla had that effortless suburban polish, lip gloss, silk blouse, and self-importance. They didn't stand. They didn't greet me. Instead, Verlette leaned back slightly in her chair, tilted her chin, and said, "Don't expect a penny, Avis. You're here for closure, not a check." It wasn't the words, it was the tone, the confidence of someone who believes the story has already ended. Clive Atwood stood by the window, stiff and neutral. He offered a polite nod, then gestured for me to sit. I pulled out the chair furthest from my mother, not because I was afraid, but because some things, like distance, are better preserved. Verlette reached into her leather folder and slid a set of papers across the table. "This is the will. Signed, notarized. No surprises." She sounded proud, like presenting a math test she already knew she aced. Clive accepted it, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. Howard Elric, my father, had left everything to Marla. The house, the savings, even the old Buick that hadn't run since 2007. My name wasn't on a single line, not even in a footnote. Marla leaned forward slightly and offered a look that tried to mimic concern. "Avis, I'm sure it's what Dad thought was best. You know how he felt about structure and your lifestyle." I didn't flinch, didn't blink. I just looked at her and thought, you always did enjoy front row seats to someone else's undoing. I turned my eyes to the paper. Neat margins, legal language, a death sentence to presents. It wasn't just about the money, not really. It was about being deliberately left out of something I helped carry. I wasn't asking to be named first. I just didn't expect to be erased completely. Marla sipped her coffee like she was waiting for applause. Verlette crossed her arms and turned her attention to her phone. I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out my small black notebook. I didn't say anything, just opened to a fresh page and wrote a date. Then one word. Nothing. Clive's eyes caught the motion. His brow lifted, just enough for me to notice, and then he cleared his throat. "Miss Delora," he began, his voice firm but measured. "Before we proceed, I have a responsibility to ask if there is any objection." I met his eyes. "There is," Verlette scoffed. "Here we go." I didn't look at her. I looked at Clive. "That's not the only will, is it?" Clive's response came with a pause that was too long to be casual. His fingers moved toward the briefcase like they were remembering what he'd promised someone long ago. But before I could press, before anything new could unfold, the meeting wrapped up with a vague, "We'll reconvene soon." Verlette acted like it was a full victory. Marla, all smug grace, gathered her designer purse as if she'd just closed escrow on a mansion she'd inherited for being obedient. I left without another word. Outside, the air was thick. Georgia in spring never lets you forget where you are. I walked slowly to my car, not because I was tired, but because my body needed to catch up with my mind. And once I got in, once the door closed, and the world muted behind me, The silence hit harder than anything Clive could have said. I drove home on autopilot, turning the radio on just to have someone else's voice in the car. By the time I walked into my apartment, the daylight had faded into that strange blue-gray that doesn't quite feel like night yet. I dropped my bag by the door, kicked off my shoes, and stood in front of the gallery wall I never finished. 5 black frames. All empty. They weren't decorative. They were placeholders, reminders of what never made it onto the wall. No family pictures. No vacation snapshots. No, look how far we've come moments. Just hollow rectangles collecting dust. I crossed the room, opened the cabinet beneath the TV, and pulled out the old shoebox I hadn't touched in years. It was labeled in my own handwriting, kept. Inside were things that didn't belong anywhere else. A clay magnet I made in 2nd grade, a hospital bracelet from when I broke my wrist climbing the magnolia in our front yard, and a stack of birthday cards I wrote to my father over the years. None of them ever sent. I held one from when I was 19. On the back, I'd scribbled, "I'm still here, Dad." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. Just a fact. Unspoken. Unacknowledged. It took me years to realize. I wasn't overlooked. I was never even considered. I sat on the couch, the box beside me, and let my eyes fall shut. The living room held a quiet that was familiar, but not friendly. And then the memories came, uninvited, but persistent. 15 years ago, Thanksgiving dinner. The family had gathered around the big table. Turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce that nobody touched. My uncle had brought his camera for the family photo. Verlette instructed everyone on where to stand. When it was time to take the shot, she looked at me and said, "Can you grab more chairs from the garage?" I remember hesitating. I remember thinking, this won't take long. But by the time I came back with the chairs, the camera had clicked, the photo taken, and the moment sealed. That framed picture hung in the hallway for years. I saw it every time I visited. 11 smiling faces, and not one of them was mine. I used to tell myself it didn't matter, that I didn't even like how I looked that year, that maybe I'd been blurry anyway. But you only lie to yourself when it's safer than the truth. And the truth? They never even noticed I wasn't in the frame. When you're excluded long enough, you stop looking for your seat at the table. You stand behind it, you serve it, and then you leave before dessert. A sharp knock pulled me back to the present. No one at the door, just the neighbor's kid slamming theirs shut again. I got up anyway, needing movement, and wandered into the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water, but didn't drink it. Instead, I found myself drifting toward the window. Across the street, porch lights flicked on one by one. People inside laughed, clinked glasses, started dinner. Families doing regular things. Together. I turned away and picked up my phone. I scrolled aimlessly, not really reading, and then I paused on a photo. A picture from last month, posted by my sister. There she was, smiling at a brunch table, arms around Verlette. The caption read, "Grateful for the woman who taught me everything." Funny. She never taught me anything except how it feels to be used and dismissed. I remembered a different day, just a week ago. I'd stopped by Verlette's house to drop off some papers for Clive. She was on the porch, sipping iced tea with her neighbor. They didn't see me right away. The neighbor asked, "And your other daughter? She's still around?" Verlette didn't miss a beat. "Avis? Oh, she's still playing artist. You know how creative types are. Emotional, impractical. Never got a real job like Marla." That word stuck with me, still, like failure was a phase I refused to grow out of. I didn't interrupt. I just walked back to my car, closed the door, and let the words settle. Now, sitting in my apartment, I opened the drawer where I kept my brushes. I pulled out a canvas I hadn't touched in months. Not because I didn't know what to paint, but because I didn't know if it would matter. Tonight, it did. I stood the canvas on its easel, stared at it, and then I began to paint. Nothing elaborate, just something of mine. A soft field, an open sky, and when it dried, I framed it. Not for them, Not for show. For me. The canvas stood drying on the easel when my phone buzzed the next morning. It was Clive, short and direct as always. "Come in," he said. "There's something that needs to be addressed before it's buried." I got dressed without much thought, threw on the same neutral blouse I wore to the first meeting, and headed out. The air was still damp from last night's rain, and the sidewalk glistened like it had secrets. By the time I reached the law office, the receptionist barely glanced up, just pointed toward the conference room. They were already there. Of course they were. Verlette in her powder blue suit, sitting upright like this was a campaign stop. Marla beside her, arms folded, lips pursed. I walked in without flinching, even as their eyes pinned me like I was the problem that refused to go away. Clive stood near the window, holding an envelope that looked different from the last one. Older, more personal. I could see the edge of handwriting on it, my father's. I didn't sit right away. I waited. He cleared his throat. "This was delivered to me privately, 2 weeks before Mr. Elric's passing," Clive began. "Sealed, witnessed, dated." Verlette didn't move. Marla shifted slightly, as if something in her tightened. Clive laid the envelope on the table. "This is the updated will." For a few seconds, no one said anything. Then Verlette leaned forward. "Howard didn't. He wasn't in any state to be." Clive didn't let her finish. "He was evaluated for legal competence the day before this was signed. Documentation is included." He opened the envelope carefully, like it might dissolve if handled wrong. As he read, I focused on a scratch on the table, something small and harmless to anchor me. "All assets," he said, "including the residence on Cottonwood Avenue, savings held at First Southern, the boat slip at Lanier Creek, and the remaining 38% stake in Elric Hardware, are to be passed solely to Avis Delora." My name. He said my name. Marla made a choking sound, quickly masked by a cough. Verlette didn't look at me, but I saw her hand twitch, barely perceptible, curling against the edge of the table. Clive finished reading and placed the papers back into the envelope. Then he looked up. "It is legally binding, fully enforceable." I didn't smile, didn't gloat. I didn't feel victorious, just visible. Marla finally spoke. "This is absurd. What's she going to do with any of that? She doesn't have kids. She's barely employed." Verlette added, "Howard would never leave the business to someone who didn't even understand how it ran." I let them spiral. Clive waited for me to respond. "I didn't ask for this," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But he chose clarity in the end." Silence followed. Not awkward, not stunned, just quiet. The kind that settles after something finally lands where it's meant to be. Clive then reached into his briefcase again, this time pulling out a USB stick. "There's one more thing," he said. He plugged it into the flat screen on the wall, turned the volume up slightly, and stepped back. My father appeared on the screen, older than I remembered, wearing the robe he used to fall asleep in when he watched late-night baseball. His voice was hoarse but strong. "If you're watching this," he said, "then I didn't get the chance to say it in person. That's my fault, like most things." He paused. The silence between his words said more than some people say in a lifetime. "Avis, I made a lot of mistakes, but none bigger than letting you feel invisible. You weren't. I saw everything. I just didn't say it." He looked down, gathered himself, and continued. "Your sister was always louder. Your mother, stronger. I assumed you didn't need me. But that wasn't true, was it?" My chest tightened. "I changed the will because it was the only way left to acknowledge you. Not because I wanted revenge on anyone else. Because I wanted you to have something with your name on it." He leaned back slowly in his chair. "Forgiveness isn't something I can ask for. Not now. But if you ever find it in you, I hope this helps start that path." The video ended. The room didn't move. Verlette's eyes were fixed on the blank screen. Marla had gone pale. Clive turned off the monitor and stepped back to the table. This recording is time-stamped and stored on 2 independent drives, one submitted to the county clerk's office. It's real. It's protected. No one spoke. Finally, I stood, adjusted my sleeves, looked at the 2 women who had spent a lifetime telling me I didn't count. "You edited me out of everything," I said, voice calm. "But you forgot. I remember." Their silence didn't last. It never does. Verlette's voice cracked the air like glass underfoot. "He wasn't in his right mind. You pushed him to this, Avis." The way she said my name, as if it was dirt on her tongue, did something strange to the room. Everything shifted. Clive looked up from the paperwork. Marla snapped her head toward me, and suddenly, the performance began. "She was alone with him every day," Marla added quickly. "You don't know what she said to him behind closed doors. Dad was vulnerable. He trusted her, and she took advantage of that." Clive held up a hand, calm but firm. "Let's clarify something. Mr. Elric's attending physician signed a formal statement of mental capacity on the same day the updated will was executed. This wasn't some coerced document scribbled on a napkin. It was reviewed, witnessed, and legally filed. You're welcome to challenge it, but I assure you, it won't hold up." Marla's lips tightened. "Oh, please." Of course, the doctor signed off, probably under pressure. People do favors all the time in this town, especially when money's involved. Verlette nodded in agreement. Howard was declining. He didn't even recognize his own grandchildren anymore, but suddenly he's coherent enough to disinherit his entire family? That word, family! They wielded it like a weapon, forgetting that it cuts both ways. I stayed seated. Still. But my hands rested on the arms of the chair like I was ready to stand if needed. I didn't flinch when they hurled their insults. I just waited. Then I spoke, calm and even. "Is that the part where you wanted to put him in a home? Because he couldn't remember your kids?" That stopped them. Marla's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Flashback, 1 year earlier, a late dinner at her house. The kids were screaming. Verlette was microwaving lasagna, and Howard was quiet, staring at a plant in the corner like he'd never seen one before. Marla had said between bites, "Honestly, it's getting exhausting. He doesn't even know who we are half the time. We should be looking into full-time care." I'd looked across the table at him. His eyes met mine. They were foggy, unsure. But I was there. He saw that. He knew. "I'm not ready to be left somewhere," he'd whispered, barely audible. Nobody responded. Back in the conference room, I reminded them. "You were ready to let him go before he was ready to leave. You said it, at that dinner. You called it a burden." Marla's jaw clenched. "That's not fair. You don't have kids. You wouldn't understand how hard it is trying to juggle everything while also dealing with—" "Your father?" I cut in. "You mean dealing with your father?" Verlette leaned in now, voice low, deliberate. "Don't twist this, Avis. You isolated him. You made him feel like we'd abandoned him." "No," I said. "You did that yourselves. I just happened to be there when he noticed." Clive shifted in his seat, pulled out a final set of documents, and slid them across the table. "We're done here for today. Avis, as per the updated will, your authority as executor is effective immediately." He handed me the folder. Verlette stared at it like it might explode. I stood slowly, took the papers with steady hands, and looked at both of them. Not with rage, not even pity, just certainty. "If you plan to come for me again," I said, voice low but clear, "bring something stronger than denial." I turned toward the door. Behind me, Marla muttered under her breath, "This isn't over." She wasn't wrong. I stepped into the hallway, and Clive followed after a few seconds. We didn't talk as we walked to the elevator. He pushed the button, hands clasped in front of him. "They're not used to losing," he finally said. "They're not used to being challenged," I replied. He nodded. "Brace yourself. They'll try again, but this time it won't be in person." He was right. What came next wasn't a confrontation. It was a strategy. Not words, but documents. Not voices, but signatures. Poison wrapped in paperwork. Clive didn't say anything as he locked the conference room door behind us. Just a nod toward the hallway and a quiet, "Follow me." We crossed through a side corridor I'd never noticed before. Smaller, windowless. Probably designed for meetings when things got ugly or uncomfortable. Fitting. He opened the door at the end and stepped aside, letting me in first. The room was cool, lined with wood shelves and a single table, already set with a thick folder. I sat down, more out of habit than fatigue. My body was awake, but my mind hadn't caught up yet. All I could hear was Marla's voice echoing from earlier. "She doesn't even have a real job." Clive took the seat across from me and slid the folder forward. "You'll want to keep these close," he said. "They were meant for you, specifically. Everything your father didn't trust them with." I opened it. Inside were stapled packets and sealed envelopes. Neat, careful, organized in a way my father never was, at least not with me. I recognized my own handwriting on some of the receipts. Emergency room invoices, pharmacy pickups, monthly statements from the care center he refused to live in. They were all there. The things I'd paid for without expecting payback. The charges I never mentioned at family dinners because I knew how that conversation would go. "You volunteered, Avis. No one forced you." At the back of the folder was a sheet labeled Designation of Sole Medical Advocate, dated and signed 2 months before he died. Clive spoke softly. "He didn't want anyone else involved in his care, Avis. He was very specific." I nodded, fingers still on the page. "They'll say I isolated him." "They already have," he replied. "But this shows something different. This shows responsibility." I took a breath and leaned back. The silence between us felt less like tension now, and more like clarity. "They always said I was the impulsive one," I murmured. "Messy, soft, too emotional to handle anything serious." Clive folded his hands. "And yet, you're the only one who kept everything." His words settled into me like bricks finding the floor. He reached into his briefcase once more, pulling out a leather-bound journal. Older, worn at the corners. I recognized it immediately. My father's. I hadn't seen it since I was a teenager. "He left this for you," Clive said. "Told me not to show it unless things got complicated." I took it gently, the leather warm in my hands. I opened it. The pages were uneven, messy, his handwriting slanted, sometimes almost unreadable. But there it was, page after page. Thoughts, observations. Some dated, some not. None of it edited. One entry stopped me cold. The ink had bled slightly from the way he'd pressed too hard. I told Marla she was brilliant because she needed it. I ignored Avis because I thought she didn't. I thought she was fine. Quiet meant fine. Turns out it meant she learned to disappear. Another entry, dated just a few weeks before he died. "Avis has been here every day. I watch her unpack groceries like she's building something. She doesn't talk much, but I don't need her to explain anything. I see it now. She was never asking for recognition, just to be seen." I closed the journal and set it down. Not out of anger, not sadness either. Just wait. Recognition is heavier when it comes too late. Clive didn't press me to say anything more. He just sat, letting the moment settle. I gathered the folder and the journal, holding them to my chest as we stood. By the time I got home, the sun had dipped below the trees, and the streetlights were buzzing with that faint hum that only seems to exist in quiet neighborhoods. I placed the papers on the kitchen table, took a long sip of water, and stood in front of my blank canvas. It had hung there for months, more protest than art. I hadn't touched it because I wasn't sure what needed to go on it. But now, it wasn't about what others might see in it. I pulled out my brushes, found the box I'd labeled in Sharpie years ago. Proof I never needed, but always kept. I opened it and slid the receipts inside, followed by the journal. Then I closed the lid and placed it on the shelf above the desk. Then, with slow, steady strokes, I painted over the canvas. Not to cover up what had never been created, but to begin something that finally was. I was rinsing brushes in the kitchen sink when the knock came. 3 firm raps, not aggressive, but official. I dried my hands, walked to the door, and opened it to find a courier holding a large envelope. "Are you Avis Delora?" I nodded. "Signature, please." He handed me a tablet, barely made eye contact. I signed, took the envelope, and closed the door. Back at the table, I slid it open. The top sheet bore the seal of Chatham County Probate Court. "Petition for conservatorship of financial affairs," it read. "Filed by Verlet Mira and Marla Genevieve." My pulse slowed. Not sped up, slowed. The kind of stillness your body reaches when it knows it's about to be tested. I flipped through the rest. Pages of accusations, emotional instability, social isolation, signs of unresolved trauma, concerning behaviors following the death of Howard Elric. Clive picked up on the second ring. "They filed this morning," he said. "They're moving fast. Hearings in 6 days." "Are they serious?" "They're not bluffing. They want your signature, your bank access, your say in everything. They want the power they think I don't deserve." He was quiet for a beat. "They're not just coming after your inheritance, Avis. They're coming after your autonomy." The hearing was held in a side courtroom tucked into the back of the courthouse, smaller than the one for the will dispute. Fewer people, more tension. Verlet wore her usual polished armor, cream blazer, minimal jewelry, fake concern. Marla played the attentive daughter, head tilted, brows furrowed like she was carrying the weight of my decline on her own shoulders. Clive sat beside me, calm as ever. My hands rested on the table, empty. I didn't need to bring anything. I was the evidence. The judge, a woman named Ramona Skeldon, had a face carved by a career in law. She looked like someone who'd seen plenty of families tear each other apart and had stopped being surprised. Marla spoke first. "We're here because we love Avis," she began. "We're not trying to hurt her. We're trying to help. She's alone. She's grieving. She talks to herself, sometimes out loud in public. Her art has taken a darker turn. I worry. We worry." Verletta added, "She hasn't held steady employment in years. She's erratic, emotional, not in a dangerous way, just not in a stable one." Clive remained still. The judge turned to me. "Miss Delora, would you like to respond before we move to evidence?" I looked at Marla, then at my mother. "I'm sure this isn't about my art style, or my voice in public. It's about control and money." "Objection." Marla's attorney tried to jump in. Judge Skeldon raised a hand. "She's allowed to speak." Clive slid a folder across the table. "Exhibits A through C, Your Honor," he said. "Bank statements, medical receipts, and a psychological evaluation from a licensed therapist. Miss Delora has no diagnosis that would disqualify her from managing her own affairs." Still, the judge asked me, "Have you experienced any mental trauma that you believe affects your current capacity?" I didn't hesitate. "I was 9, I said. Had a fever over 100. My teacher called home. No one answered. I stayed at school until the janitor found me crying in the break room. He called someone, can't even remember who. Eventually, a substitute teacher drove me home. I didn't eat dinner that night. I just sat in my room and realized, if I got sick again, I needed to keep it to myself." No one spoke. "That moment didn't break me," I continued, "but it shaped me. I learned how to function without being checked on." Verlette shifted in her seat. For once, no quip, no retort. I turned to face her and Marla fully. "You don't think I'm capable of managing money?" I asked, quieter now. I was capable enough to track every bill, every appointment, every medicine Dad needed. I buried him without help from either of you. I organized everything while you were busy drafting smear campaigns. Gasps echoed behind us. A few people shifted in the gallery. Judge Skeldon took off her glasses. Her eyes landed on Verlet first. "I've seen real instability," she said. Emotional volatility, poor decision-making, paranoia. That's not what I see in Miss Delora. What I see is grief, processed quietly, but with clarity. She is not unfit, she's just alone. She signed the ruling. Petition denied. Outside the courtroom, I didn't speak to anyone. Not Clive. Not the reporters by the steps. I walked straight to my car. I sat behind the wheel and took one slow breath. They had tried to strip me of my name, my rights, and now, my mind. But I was still here, still me. 3 days passed without a word. No calls, no emails, no drama, just quiet. But in families like mine, silence was never surrender. It was a smokescreen. I was at Clive's office that Friday morning when his assistant knocked lightly and peeked in. "There's a call from the probate office, said it's urgent." Clive excused himself. I stayed seated, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup that had already started to bleed around the rim. I stared out the window as the azaleas bloomed along the courthouse lawn across the street. When he returned, his face said everything. "They flagged a document." He dropped into his chair, hands steepled. "During the conservatorship hearing, your mother and sister listed themselves as active fiduciary custodians over your father's estate. Problem is, there's no court record supporting that." I raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning they filed fraudulent documents. Likely assumed no one would ever double-check." I leaned forward. "How bad is it?" Clive opened a file on his laptop and swiveled it toward me. "They submitted this 2 weeks before your father passed. Backdated, unsigned by him, yet stamped by a clerk during a weekend rotation. It was slipped into the records like it belonged." My jaw tightened. "They tried to legally take over his assets before he even died." "They acted like the estate was theirs," Clive confirmed. "But your father never authorized any of it. It's illegal, plain and simple." I folded my arms across my chest. "So what's next?" He paused, then opened a drawer in his desk. From it, he pulled a sealed envelope, thicker than anything I'd seen so far. The seal was already broken. The paper yellowed slightly around the edges. "Your father left this with me the same day he revised his will. Told me to deliver it only if you were challenged unfairly." He handed it to me. I opened it slowly. Inside was a lawsuit, fully prepared, fully notarized, addressed to Verlet Mira and Marla Genevieve, filed on the grounds of financial misconduct, attempted fraudulent custodianship, and falsification of public documents. I flipped through the pages until I saw it. Dahlia Reeves' name, a signed affidavit. She had detailed the months leading up to his death, how I'd handled all his care, that no one else had shown up, that Verlet and Marla came only for photographs and convenient appearances. Clive's voice brought me back. "The documents are airtight. It's not a matter of if we win. It's whether you want to press forward." I stared at the folder in my lap. "What happens if we settle?" "They avoid court, keep their reputations intact, probably spin it into some kind of misunderstanding." I sat with the thought for a moment. Then I shook my head. "No," I said. "Let them stand in front of a judge and say it out loud. Let them explain under oath how they tried to erase me." Again. Clive nodded slowly. "We'll file this morning." It didn't take long. By the time I left the office, the summons were already being delivered. I imagined Marla receiving hers in her driveway, still in yoga pants, coffee in hand. I imagined her smile falter for once. I imagined Verletta answering her door in pearls and panic. That night, I didn't celebrate. I didn't even mention it when Clive texted later to say the paperwork had been received. I stayed home, sitting at my kitchen table, going over every page of the lawsuit like it was a map. Not because I didn't trust Clive, but because I needed to see it with my own eyes, line by line, signature by signature, the paper trail of what they thought I wouldn't catch. They didn't know I paid attention, that I always had. They underestimated the quiet one. The morning of the trial arrived with no thunder, no sign, just a clear sky and the kind of quiet that settles over a town right before it's forced to choose sides. I woke before the alarm, dressed in black slacks and a simple blouse, and pulled my hair back into a low knot. Practical, presentable, unshakable. Clive picked me up at 8. He didn't ask if I slept. We both knew the answer. The courtroom wasn't packed, but it wasn't empty either. A few neighbors. A couple of local reporters pretending not to eavesdrop. No cameras, just faces. Observing, judging, waiting. Marla sat directly across from me, arms crossed, jaw tight. She didn't speak, but her expression did. It said, "You shouldn't be here." Verletta sat beside her, hands clasped neatly in her lap like she was attending a recital. She wore a brooch I recognized, a silver hummingbird I'd made her in 8th grade. I hadn't seen her wear it since. Judge Skeldon entered, adjusted her robe, and nodded toward Clive. He stood, as calm as ever, and opened with what felt less like a legal statement and more like a reckoning. This trial is not about bitterness. It's about boundaries. Not about inheritance, but intention. The defendants presented themselves as custodians, yet never earned that trust. My client didn't seek to own anything. She simply refused to be erased again. He sat. No dramatics. No flair. Verletta's attorney rose next. He launched into a practiced monologue about family confusion, miscommunications, and clerical misunderstandings. He painted Verlette as a devoted mother, Marla as an overwhelmed daughter, and me as a woman who had let grief twist her perceptions. She was emotionally fragile, he said. Grief can cloud judgment, make us believe in versions of events that don't reflect reality. I didn't flinch. Then it was Dahlia's turn. She walked to the stand in navy slacks and a white blouse, simple and clean, her hair pulled back like mine. She looked directly at the judge, never once at Verlette or Marla. "I was Mr. Elric's in-home nurse for 8 months before he passed," she began. "Miss Delora was there every day. She paid for everything out of pocket. She kept a log. She coordinated appointments. She even fixed a broken toilet herself when the landlord didn't respond." Laughter stirred in the gallery. Quiet but real. Dahlia continued. "Marla came once, with a photographer. Verletta never showed up. Not for meals, not for doctor visits, not even in the final week." Marla's attorney objected, citing hearsay, but the judge allowed it. When Dahlia stepped down, Judge Skeldon turned to me. "Miss Delora, would you like to speak before we review final statements?" I stood. My voice didn't shake, not even once. "I never asked for any of this. Not the house, not the money, not the judgment." I paused. What I wanted was simple. I wanted to be remembered, not as a nuisance or a mistake, but as a daughter. I took a breath and looked at them, my mother and sister. "You claimed I was unstable, that I wasn't fit to manage the estate, or my own life. But I was the one who sat beside my father when he couldn't hold a spoon. I was the one who slept on a cot in his room. I was the one who stayed when his memory left him, and when it left me, too." Verletta looked away. Marla stared at the floor. I didn't stay because I had something to prove. I stayed because no one else did. The room was still when I finished. Judge Skeldon folded her hands. "The court finds the documents presented by Verlette Myra and Marla Genevieve to be invalid and intentionally misleading. Miss Delora remains the rightful executor of Howard Elric's estate." She paused, then added, "There will be no criminal charges, but let the public record reflect this misconduct clearly, for all who might be tempted to use grief as a cover for greed." The gavel sounded once. Final. Unmistakable. Outside, the air felt sharper. I walked down the courthouse steps, passing Marla and Verlette as they stood to the side. Neither of them spoke, but I did. "You wanted the world to see me as unstable," I said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. "But now the world sees you." I didn't wait for their reactions. I didn't need them. That night, I didn't toast. I didn't post. I didn't tell anyone how it felt to be vindicated in front of strangers. I cleaned the kitchen. I made tea. I opened the last letter my father ever wrote me. After the kettle clicked off, I poured the hot water over a chamomile bag and sat at the kitchen table with the letter in my hands. The envelope was heavier than it should have been, like time had soaked into the paper, like silence had made it dense. To be opened when the noise stops. That's what he'd written on the front. Howard Elrich's handwriting, all jagged edges and slanted loops. It was a familiar mess. I peeled it open slowly, careful not to rip it, and unfolded the single page inside. No date, no salutation, just words, raw, rambling, honest. I know by now you've read everything else, it began. The will, the journal, probably even the receipts. You always kept the pieces others didn't think mattered. I paused, thumb pressed against the edge of the paper, letting my eyes scan the next line before I could decide how I felt. I'm sorry I remembered everyone but you at the end. I forgot a lot of things, but I never forgot that you were there. Even when I didn't have the words for it. Especially then. The room was quiet. No clocks ticking, no traffic outside, just the sound of my own breathing filling the space. He continued, scribbled but legible. I think about the mornings you made toast and left it on the edge of the tray, knowing I liked the crusts cut off but wouldn't say it out loud. I remember the time you rubbed my legs when they cramped up so bad I couldn't sleep. You didn't say anything, you just did it. You always just did it. I blinked hard, not from pain, not quite from sadness either, just release. I failed you, the letter read. Not in the loud ways people expect, not with shouting or abandonment, but in the quiet ways, the missed calls, the forgotten questions. I thought you didn't need much because you never asked. That was my mistake. I assumed silence meant strength. My hands loosened around the page. I could almost hear his voice, not the version from the video, or even from his last year, but the one from a long time ago. The one who used to hum when he built things in the garage. It's not just that I didn't give you what you earned, he'd written near the end, the ink faint where his hand must have shaken. It's that I didn't recognize what you were carrying. You were the one holding it all together. You always were. I folded the letter slowly and placed it in the box where I kept everything else. Journal, legal papers, receipts. I didn't seal it. Some things didn't need to be locked away anymore. I stood, stretched my back, and walked toward the living room where the easel still sat by the window. The canvas I'd been avoiding all week waited patiently, untouched, since the night I painted over it. This time, I didn't hesitate. I laid out my brushes, mixed the colors deliberately. Warm tones, soft lines, not abstract, not distant. This time, I painted a face. Mine. Not a self-portrait in the traditional sense. There was no exact likeness, but the shape of the shoulders, the light in the eyes, the stillness in the mouth. It was me, the version I'd spent years hiding behind everyone else's definition of who I was supposed to be. Not the forgotten daughter, not the problem, not the one who left, or was left. Just me. When it dried, I didn't frame it. I hung it just as it was, canvas exposed, rough around the edges. But it was whole, and it was mine. I stepped back and looked at the wall. The space that once held empty frames and cracked glass now held something full, something honest. They erased me from the records, I whispered aloud, as if saying it one last time made it real. But I've reclaimed something they never owned. It wasn't about being written into a will, or spoken of in polite conversation. It was about knowing, finally, that I had always belonged, even when no one handed me proof. And for once, I didn't need a frame to know I belonged in the picture. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with something from my heart. Not as a daughter, not as someone who fought for justice, but as a person who survived being overlooked. Sometimes the deepest scars are the ones no one else sees. Not because they're hidden, but because no one ever bothered to look. I spent years believing I needed permission to exist in the spaces I helped build, waiting for someone to say, "You belong here." But the truth is, you don't need a frame to prove your worth. Not in a family photo, not in a boardroom, not in life. If you've ever felt invisible, in your family, in your job, in your marriage, I want you to know that being quiet does not mean being weak, and being left out does not mean you are without value. You have every right to take up space, speak up, and reclaim your story, even if it means standing alone to do it. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been the one who stayed quiet too long? Were you ever written out of your own family's story? Or maybe you've fought to be seen and won. Share your experience in the comments. Let's talk about it. Let's learn from one another. And hey, if this story moved you, if it touched something in your heart, drop a 1 in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, city, state, country. Or if you didn't like this story, tell me why. I'm always open to listening. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. If you want more stories like this, honest, emotional, and real, this is the place. We have so much more to talk about, and your voice matters here. Thanks for listening. I see you, and I'm glad you're here.